Welcome back to Think Tech. I'm Jay Fidel. This is View from the North. Today we're asking, how does Canadian immigration and immigration policy differ from that of the US? And what can the US learn from how Canada does it? And we discuss this with Dr. Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman in Kelowna, British Columbia. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hello, Jay. This is a subject where Canada is very different than the US.
Well, that's better because the US ain't so good. The US has needed immigration reform for decades and decades. A friend of mine worked in Congress on immigration reform, and he wrote so many bills that never even got considered over a lifetime. So, what happens now is it deteriorates further. So, my first question to you is, Ken, to explore the differences. Have any migrants come to Canada from Latin America and from Africa, from Europe, from Ukraine? Do you have the same kind of border situation that we do? The same kind of policy issues that we do about migrants and immigration?
Well, in theory, we have, many of the same problems, but a lot of them, they're just at different degrees. You start off with, physically, Canada geographically has only one neighbor, and that's the United States. So people can't walk across the border into Canada unless they're an American or they're coming from the United States. Now, where the US, the Mexican border is a very major problem. That's the whole issue in the United States. Nobody cares about, you know, Canadians moving into the US, but they certainly care about the southern border. Well, your immigration in the US is a big political subject, and yet it's as if the subject was because the sheer quantity of immigration. Well, that's just not correct if you compare it with Canada, or let's just say Canada has a population that's about 11% of what the population of the US is. But we have about one third as many new immigrants into Canada each year as the US does. That is, we have 1.25 million, new immigrants into Canada. But the basis of the immigration is very different. The cornerstone of the U.S. immigration policy is what I call family reunification. So where in Canada the family reunification amounts to about the same number of immigrants per capita relative to Canada, but most of our family reunification is where someone comes to Canada on a temporary permit to be a college student. When they have a college degree in Canada, they, are attractive for Canadian jobs. And so the family reunification then comes to a great extent because you've got some educated person brings some of their family members. Well, the definition of family reunification in Canada is not as broad as in the US. You can't bring your mother-in-law and your, you grandson or something. It's got to be pretty direct family. Where the cornerstone in Canadian immigration is all economic based. We have 12 times as many immigrants proportionally as the US does on economic grounds. Our economy, for example, in the recent 5-year period that they had some statistics, 80% of the labor force growth in Canada came from immigrants, from the direct immigration. Um, And Canada has a point system for who's better for the Canadian economy than the next person. What are we short of? Now, we use two temporary immigration programs uh, very heavily. Um, let's say about two-thirds of the immigrants that come into Canada each year are on a temporary basis. And virtually all of those are students or temporary workers. And you get a special temporary work permit. For example, where I live, it's a very major agricultural area in terms of orchards and wine growing. And we have just tons of Mexicans come on temporary work permits. But if they've worked here for, you know, each season for 2 or 3 years, some of them even get to work year round, um, then, they become attractive new residents. Like they, can move from the temporary status to a full-time status. And so you really have a pretty smooth way of doing it. Similarly with the colleges, Canada stands on their head in particular to get graduate students, uh, and that they will, when somebody's got their college degree, then they uh, obviously would be attractive to Canadian industry for jobs, and uh, and so they join the labor force, and then they may bring their family members. Now, one of the big differences with Canada and the U.S. is we don't have Mexican border. We did recently have a bit of a Mexican problem, is we had so many Mexican workers that had come here on a temporary basis that eventually became citizens, that it became evident to a Mexican that Canada wasn't really all snow and ice. There were some really nice places to live in Canada that even a Mexican could enjoy. And so they started to have, because of all the tourist flights from Canada to Mexico, there's some pretty cheap airline flights sometimes of the year. And so, a smart Mexican with just not very many bucks could fly to Canada, pretend they're coming on a temporary basis, and then, try to stay, much like people try to walk across the US border, um, or wade across if you're thinking of the Rio Grande. Um, and they actually had to change. Just a very recent change was that, uh, we used to have Mexicans could come to Canada without a visa, the same as Americans don't need a visa to come to Canada. And they just, changed that back to requiring Mexicans to have visas to avoid that minuscule problem in terms of quantity. Somebody with enough money for an airplane flight, wasn't going. So the U.S. Southern border, you're sitting where, as I understand the statistics, nearly 50% of the people that show up at the border get rejected. Well, Canada doesn't have a big rejection rate because how do you get here to be rejected? Like asylum or refugees are not a big problem.
Why not? It seems to me that if I'm trying to get into the United States from the southern border, and the United States is theoretically attractive, they hear nice stories from relatives and friends who live here. So they try to cross over and have a better life. But Canada is a rule of law country. It's a country with opportunity. In many ways, it's a country with a government that cares more about you than in the U.S., or at least the Republicans care less about you. But why doesn't somebody who's coming in from Latin America say, "Gee, I'm not going to fool around in the U.S. southern border. It's too much trouble and risk, barbed wire, what have you, political machinations. Why don't I just go to Canada? I'll find a way to go to Canada. I'll beg, borrow, steal the money for that airplane, and I'll wind up in Canada, and I'll be happy there. I mean, I feel that's an opportunity waiting to happen for a lot of people from Latin America. Why isn't it happening?
Well, the Latin America needs the money for the airplane flight, and you know, those people that arrive on an asylum basis would be, sorted out the same as in the US, and probably the same percentage would be rejected. But there's just people don't do that. One of the odd items in Canada, because one of our provinces, Quebec, speaks French, or at least the official language is French, but about a third of the province primary language is English, mainly in Montreal. But um, people from Haiti that speak English, which had all of their horrendous problems and made it into the U.S. somehow or another, they actually went to New York State, upstate to the border between New York State and Quebec, and were walking across the border there, and the place, they famously gave it a name that every Canadian knew. Roxham Road was because you could, when you arrived in New York City, you could actually hire a cab and drive you to that border. And they had regular service to get people to go to that border, and those were Latin Americans that preferred, particularly anybody that spoke French. That was their spot that they preferred to come. So yeah, the odd Caribbean island, other than Haiti, where there was French speaking, and that was the route that they've used.
All this raises the question of the quality and intensity of enforcement of the immigration laws regarding immigration, sanctuary, refugee status, all that. How well organized is the border patrol to the extent that it's like that Canada has a border patrol? How much enforcement do you see? How much contention do you see? I mean, how much legal process do you see rejecting people who want to come across who really don't qualify? How much investigation is going on to find the people who don't qualify and identify them, maybe put them in jail, maybe send them back? What kind of process is going on? What do you see in the newspaper about
Well, Border Patrol, when you watch TV and you see the American southern border, Border Patrol tends to be agents in airplanes or vehicles monitoring the U.S. Mexican border for people trying to come across illegally. Well, the only border we've got is with the U.S., about 4,000 miles worth, and I don't think there's anybody that patrols it. We have official border crossings, where you drive up and, there's a booth on the Canada side and a booth on the American side. And you got to, when you're leaving Canada, you don't even wave to the Canadian booth. And when you arrive at the American, it takes very little time, and click, click, and you can go into the US from Canada and vice versa. Um, Now, if you're not an American, then the agent at the border crossing, an official crossing, checks your documents and so on. And that's about it. I mean, if you could somehow arrive in Canada, uh, without going through a border station, you could be here for a long time and nobody would give a hoot. unless you need a work permit, like a social insurance number or the equivalent driver's license, those kinds of things. Eventually those, would have you registered somehow somewhere, but generally we just don't have a problem with undocumented residents.
So you don't have immigration agents running around doing raids on businesses and arresting people, incarcerating them, and then deporting them. You don't have that.
No.
Hmm. What about the
We
ocean?
actually, I know of one example, just show you how extreme this one is. A lady that I knew reasonably well was a flight attendant for a Middle East airline, and they suddenly decided that they weren't going to pay any benefits or something, and they could hire uh, staff that were cheaper than these people. She was from Britain. Well, she had parents that lived in Canada who became ill. And so when she left this airline, she came as a caregiver. And she just came in, by an airplane and, showed her British passport and so on. And you hear to, for, as if it was like a visit, but she decided to care for her parents. Well, eventually both parents died, and 15 years later, she applied for some government aid, and they says, "Well, how come you're here?" And because she was on, in a sense, welfare need, you know, the Canadian government paid for her airplane and flew her back to England. And this is the only case I know of anybody, in that sense where I had any personal connection with anybody that had any role.
Oh, that's so
Um,
interesting. What about the oceans? I mean, we have a lot of, for example, we have a lot of drugs that are moving into the United States through the coasts, through the ocean. Why can't you talk about these stations along this 4,000-mile border? But why can't I just get in a boat and come from somewhere in the Caribbean or come from somewhere in the U.S.? I mean, as an illegal U.S. immigrant, and take a boat to Nova Scotia. I mean, in the summertime, Ken, in the summertime, um, and enter Canada that way. I mean, is there any action to find me, to exclude me, to arrest me, to enforce the immigration laws against people who come in by odd means that way?
well, we do have a Coast Guard, but it's really not much. It's pretty pathetic. Um, and their equipment is pretty old, so that if your boat was fairly new and fast moving, you could get around them anyhow. But in order to get to a port in Canada, you either have to come across the Arctic Ocean, or you have to come past the U.S. Like if you have an ocean crossing craft, you have enough money. You don't need to come to Canada illegally. You could easily get to Canada or the US on some other logical basis. It's really asylum seekers that are trying to walk across a border, and you just can't walk across very easily in Canada. um, so we just don't have the problem with the illegal immigration. But one of the key points is just the sheer quantity of immigration. Like the United States, if you listen to the news, one of the favorite phrases in the US is, "We are a country of immigrants." Well, you're sure not a country of immigrants compared to Canada. That your um, population, of 330 some million, and you let in 1.6 million immigrants in I think was either last year or the year before, and we let in 1.2 million immigrants. Like now 2/3 of ours were those two temporary categories. But those convert fairly quickly. Give them a 5-year click, and at least 80% of those temps convert into permanent citizens. And similarly, in the United States, about 15% of the US population was born outside the United States. Well, nearly 25% of Canadians were born outside Canada. I mean, it's just a huge difference.
This reflects the public opinion of Canadians and certainly of Canadian officials about about allowing immigrants to come into the country. It reminds me of Singapore, where Singapore will say, "Hey, we need 1 million people to staff various businesses. So we're going to open the floodgates. We're going to take in 1 million people. We're going to give them whatever visas are appropriate. We're going to give them jobs. We'll place them and we'll give them homes and we'll let them buy the homes, usually apartments in these high rises. And that way we make sure that our economy is staffed by the necessary number of people, namely immigrants. And I suspect that that's kind of the public policy in Canada, where the officials over years and many administrations have said we want extra people and more people, so we'll open the floodgates. We'll be really liberal about letting people in, letting diverse groups of people in. We're not opposed to that. We'll encourage that. We'll structure it, we'll manage it, but we're going to take a lot more people. This is not an accident that you have so many people coming in relative to the US. So, what's your sense of the public opinion and public policy that underlies all of that?
Well, before COVID, there was never anybody grumbled about immigration in Canada, where before COVID, that was always one of the top subjects in the US political era of just what stinks about American policy, and immigration was pretty high on lots of people's list, despite the fact that immigration, as a proportion of the population or the sheer size of it, just didn't compare at all to Canada. As Canadians that have, how could you possibly complain about immigration? It's a great thing. I mean, they're filling all these jobs. They're like, your demographics are such that the birth rates, uh, how many children are there per woman? In Canada, it's only about 1.25. In the US, it's about 1 and 3 or 1 and 3/4. Still less than two, which you need to maintain a population. Now, counting the baby boomer uh, era coming of retirement age, your workforce shortage is exaggerated, and to avoid the problem like Japan has of declining population, and they just don't allow much in the way of immigration. The immigrants provide um, a lot of things that are really important. One of the factors are jobs that other people don't wish to do. That's a main thing. Like all of the agriculture in California and Florida, immigrants work in the hot weather uh, very well compared to a typical American or typical Canadian. Canadians don't like to, you know, pick cherries and apples and other fruit and So we have the Mexicans come and then they integrate into the economy, and then the next wave of them comes,
Well, it's all
and
good. It's all good. So, you mentioned, and I think it's really important that the central difference in policy between the U.S. and Canada is that we have this kind of family connection um, system that allows people to come in and get visas and permanent residence on the basis of a family connection, rather than an economic skill trade that's useful to the economy. Although I can tell you there are certain limited categories of people who demonstrate that they have some skill that's necessary and helpful. They can come in, but I don't think it's that many people. The bar is much higher than you would imagine. Okay, and so in Canada, they've got to demonstrate that they have some value to the economy. In my view, that's a really much better system. But what happens in a world of trouble? What happens when you have to consider groups of nationalities? If I'm, for example, potentially, I could be a member of Hamas or Hezbollah or some other terrorist organization. Am I being screened out? Am I being profiled as an Arab? Trump at one point he was going to stop everybody from every Arab country. If you remember, I mean, people forget these things, but that's what happened when he first took office. And it was pretty gross because he was profiling, hundreds of millions of people that way. But what does Canada do? Does Canada like this group and dislike that group? Does Canada have, racial or ethnic or cultural divides when it allows people to come in, even for an economically valuable purpose?
well, we have always had uh, on a world scale, fairly positive attitude towards asylum seekers. Now, of course, they can't show up on their own. They got to have help getting there. So, we've had a bunch of Afghan, I don't know whether you call them Afghanis or people from Afghanistan, anyhow. But they were mainly ones that helped the Canadian military force there. And, even though we in theory would have them, we've still been pretty slow to do it. A lot of Afghanis who assisted the Canadian military there actually, you know, had panicked and left and went to Pakistan because Canada was so slow to get them here.
Mm.
Similarly, we had a ton of people from Vietnam near the end of the Vietnam War. Even though Canada didn't play a military role in Vietnam, we still had asylum seekers from there. We've had a ton of people from the Middle East, and our screening system is no more brilliant than the American. So when you've got somebody with a passport that says they're coming from the United Arab Emirates, how is your border authority to know that they really came from Syria and they were one of these Iranian mob squads or whatever you call riot groups. um, the but we do get our share of people. I mean, you still end up with you know uh, you know somebody who was a German Nazi had lived in Canada for 30 or 40 years, without anybody recognizing who they were or what they were. So we've got far from perfect, and it's only in the last 2 years that there really has been any major complaints by Canadians about immigration, and that's solely because of our housing crisis.
Ah,
is the cause, and then it goes back up the chain. And part of the housing crisis was this: Canada was so open on these student visas, especially for graduate students, that some of these private universities, call them Trump University type of scams, okay, it opened solely to because foreigners could come in and apply for a university permit, and these were all set up almost as a way to get into Canada without really wanting to get a university degree or whatever. And so you had a ton of these universities where somebody had come and they would, you know, they'd get into Canada because they were a student and had the university papers. And then the college would then, let them go for one course, let's say, and they would be able to get a job somewhere. And so, 5 years later, somebody finds out here's this person that only took one course the first year, or maybe they kept taking one course, and 5 years later, they still haven't finished their first year of college. Um, and that abuse, is one of the items that without the housing crisis, nobody'd have ever even followed up the chain to find out how come we have this problem.
how about the marriage abuse? That has been a steady example of abuse in the country, in this country, where you marry somebody, and based on that marriage, you get some kind of visa, maybe citizenship, because of the marriage. But the marriage isn't real. The marriage is a fraud marriage, only for the purpose of getting immigration status. Do you have that? In other words, if I marry a Canadian citizen, will I get a visa? And if I marry that citizen without the intention of really being married, will I be caught and thrown out of the country?
Um, I would assume it happens here about the same as the U.S., and I would assume that you wouldn't get caught about the same as in the U.S. Um, it's not a big issue.
uh Okay, well, we must discuss one thing before we run out of time, and that's this. It looks every day more and more like Trump could be the next president. And there are people, who don't care. They don't realize what changes will take place. And there are other people who do care as a philosophical matter, an ideological matter, and they worry a lot about their life and their quality of life changing. Whether it's, real or, exaggerated, they worry. And so the question is, if they wanted to leave, the number one possible country that's like the US, the number one place that has a rule of law, civil rights, an economy that is similar to the US economy, a quality of life similar to the US, it would be Canada. But the question is, how does the average American get to go there legally and get an immigrant visa legally? And then from that, get to be a citizen of Canada legally. How long does it take? That's a really big question. How long does it take? And what does that individual have to do to go through the process to get to be a Canadian? I remember you talked about Vietnam. I remember, all these young people, they didn't want to serve in the army, so they went to Montreal. They didn't
Well,
necessarily speak French either.
they didn't just go to Montreal. We have a huge area of British Columbia that was just loaded with Americans who wanted to avoid the draft. It's the area. It's in British Columbia called the Kootenays. It's just an absolutely gorgeous area. It's right north of Idaho, like northern Idaho and western Montana are two of the most beautiful places in the United States, like Glacier Park and that type of stuff. Although they don't have glaciers in anywhere at ground level, it's like go up the Columbia River, where it starts in Canada, or the that area, and we have tons of those. But in terms of your question, the uh, it's easier to come from the United States to Canada than it is to come from almost any other country. We started off in the British Commonwealth, so you could come from Britain or Australia or New Zealand, um, you know, pretty easily. But an American with a job and with economic talent would immediately be high on the points list. Canada's jobs orientation or economic basis of immigration is, you'd have a secondary factor, it'd be language. Well, Americans don't have a language problem, a custom problem. Well, they'd say you got to leave your gun behind. That is, on some basis, if I were the agent, I might say I'd let an Australian in before I'd let an American in if I had to pick for two people with exactly the same qualifications. You know, um, um, just that minor difference in some social attitudes. Um,
Mhm.
however, the ability of somebody an American to come to Canada on really short notice, you know, could easily be in Canada working away if they were employable, um, while their uh, status is processed. But the likelihood of a rejection is almost negligible if they've got a job. I mean, I remember growing up in Calgary, Alberta, and in when I started university, there was maybe 150,000 people in Calgary. There's now 1.5 million people
Wow.
in that city. It's more than 1.5 million. I mean, very successful, sparkly city. Uh, much like Massachusetts, that very high standard living compared to everywhere else. Well, the high school I went to it was about 50% Americans or sons of Americans who came to Alberta to work in the oil industry. They just transferred in from with their corporations, much like I worked in Salt Lake City for several years, and I had an employment visa. I forgot what it was called, but it was really the employer said, we need this person and they've got qualifications that really suit our purposes, and we're having trouble finding somebody else that can do that. And so click, and I get this 3-year visa, and then it was diddly squat to have it renewed. And I was not at the time interested in applying for full-time citizenship, but that type of thing in reverse is readily available for any American with any skill.
What about citizenship? Suppose I really like it in Canada, and
Well,
I don't feel like
how
going.
could one not? I got to interrupt. And say, could one not like it in Canada? I suppose one could say it depends where you go.
Uh-huh.
You know, like one of our temporary work permits was for you know a bunch of the industries in the far north. Where I don't know that that would be too attractive for so many people. However, sorry to interrupt you there.
No, I just wonder what the track is to get from a work visa, call it. I'm sure there are multiple possibilities, categories of work visa, but from a work visa to a permanent resident, to a citizen. How many of the people in the high school, if you followed them, or in Calgary, or in the cities of Canada that came from the U.S., ultimately became or become Canadian citizens?
Well, a lot were dual citizens. I remember a bunch of the kids in my high school. they were pretty startled with her getting American draft. That was Vietnam era.
Oh no.
But anyhow, a bunch, became Canadian citizens, and a bunch did not, just move back to the U.S. But there's lots
Mhm.
of Canadians that moved to the U.S., worked there for a while, then moved back to Canada, and vice versa. One of my sons lives in Los Angeles.
Canada has a certain kind of open door policy, and a lot of people, are very appreciative of that. There are a lot of people who came from Europe after World War II, and nobody would accept them except Canada. Canada accepted them, and then ultimately they wended their way into the United States. But Canada was a tolerant, accepting place along the way, and it had a global reputation for that. Now you have complications in the world that you have described here, and I wonder where it's all going. Is Canada going to remain an open door country, or perhaps is Canada going to start closing its doors? Are people going to react to events around the world and kind of shut the door, maybe on certain groups or in general? What are your thoughts about the future?
Well, um, the Canadian government officially increased the number of immigrants they're allowing per year. And that's sort of measure one, where the U.S., the whole orientation of the Republican Party is to reduce the immigration, even though Canada has proportionally about 3 times as much immigration as the U.S. Um, the racial tensions do arise in Canada. For example, there's a neighborhood in metropolitan Vancouver called Surrey, or let's call it much like you'd say the Bronx is part of New York, Surrey is part of Vancouver. And there's about, 750,000 people live in Surrey, but it's very, very heavily um, Punjabi, or let's call it from the Sikhs, Sihk, however, whether say it's Sikh or Sikh, how it's said, and that there's a ton of gang wars that really came from the countries that those people came from. Where they want to fight each other, and the violence is just un-Canadian. Like this one suburb of Vancouver has more crime than all the rest of the metro together, including the downtown. Um, and so there's um, actions of people create uh, disgruntled attitudes. You know, like my example a
Being
couple minutes ago.
The Canadians become disenchanted with the groups that are fighting among themselves.
Yes, but also the example of, Netanyahu, you know, massacring people in Gaza, doing inhumane things against the Gazans, develops an animosity towards whoever he is and his group, and the anti-Jewish sentiment that has arisen is solely related to that. Like, the sympathy. There was no great problem
So
before that.
you think this is going to be a change in Canada? Sensitivity to things happening elsewhere, and maybe disapproval of groups that are coming from elsewhere by association.
No,
Is the open door policy going to change?
no,
Uh,
no.
okay, I
It's
just wanted to get your thought on that. We got to go. We're way over. So Ken Rogers, Dr. Ken Rogers, retired businessman par excellence, uh, from Kelowna, British Columbia, helping us understand not only the immigration laws and policies of Canada, but how it works on the ground. Thank you so much, Ken.
aloha from Western Canada.
Aloha.